And look, we are in for a treat here with Tim Gollins to speak to us. I've had the pleasure of catching up with Tim over the last few days, and I do think we're in for really very, very stimulating, informative discussion, and hopefully some very provocative question and answer session at the end of it. Tim he has a long history with public record keeping in general, but also digital preservation in particular. He started his career with the UK Technical Civil Service back in 1987, and since then, over his career, he's worked in information security, information management, design and development on many large government information projects. Tim joined the National Archives of the UK, TNA, back in April 2008, and as head of digital preservation in that fine institution, he led some really groundbreaking work on digital preservation and cataloguing, and which has resonated the world over. He worked on the design and implementation of a new digital records infrastructure at TNA, embodying the parsimonious preservation approach that he developed. And recently, he's completed a secondment in the School of Computing Science at Glasgow University, where he studied the challenges of digital sensitivity review, also a subject very close to my heart, close to our hearts here. And I hope you'll touch on that in your presentation, or more than touch on that. Tim, as we say, has got more degrees than a thermometer. He holds a BS Bachelor of Science in Chemistry at Exeter, Master of Science in Computing Science, UCL, Master of Science in Information Management from Sheffield. Tim was a director of the Digital Preservation Coalition, another fine organisation that we follow very closely over here, for 6 years with the DPC, and that was from 2009, I should say, and is also a former member of the University of Sheffield iSchools Advisory Panel. So will you please join me in welcoming to the podium Tim Gollins. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I start, I too wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on, the Whadjuk Noongar people. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. And I also wish to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. It's my pleasure to be a visitor in this place. I'd like to thank the Society of Australian Archivists, the Australian Society of Archivists, get it right, Gollins, and the organising committee for inviting me to give this address. I'd also like to thank the National Archives of Australia and David for sponsoring my travel, for making it possible for me to visit more of this country, and for inviting me to contribute to their discussions next week in Canberra. I hope I can do justice to all of their commitment. Now, a health warning. I should tell you, I am not an archivist, okay? I have no formal archival training or qualifications. My background, as you've heard, is computing science, information security, and information management. My experience is a practical rather than academic. In the first 20 years of my career, I was based in the rather obscure world of high security information systems, which you might think has little relevance to archives. But I've discovered that there's much more in common than one might imagine between the world of high security and, frankly, intelligence and the challenges of digital preservation in a national archival context. Now, my knowledge of archival theory is based on a process of infusion, and therefore dodgy, from colleagues fueled by my curiosity and occasional bemusement over time, and that's both at UK National Archives and more recently at the National Records of Scotland. As I was developing this paper, and in the knowledge I was to deliver it here, I've become aware that many of my understandings that I've accrued through this process of infusion are not as universal as I might have thought and perhaps might have hoped. So forgive the schoolboy errors as I go through in placing myself in your context, because I'll probably mess it up. Now, much of what I'm talking about here has been evolving, morphing, and crystallizing over quite a few years. And as I said, it's drawn from this strange combination of an exposure to highly sensitive material and processing of highly sensitive material early in my career, and now the problem of having to keep material for a very long, digital material for a very long time. It's therefore necessarily an individual perspective. I hope you'll find it interesting, and I hope it'll stimulate some discussion. Finally, having said all that, I do hope that my background gives me an opportunity to take a different perspective, to challenge and perhaps encourage our community to step back and consider things outside the acid-free box. Now, in the spirit of the lovely welcome to country we got yesterday from Dr. Richard Wally, I'm going to start with a small and short personal story. These are the things I'm going to briefly cover, so we'll go past all of that. So, a short story. I'm going to talk to you about my maternal grandfather, Dennis, or as I knew him, Lionel Prosser. So, Lionel was born in a small village called Elmore, which lies on the southeastern bank of the River Severn. You can tell I come from that area, by the way, if you know English accents at all. You'll get that Gloucestershire twang is still there, despite the fact I've moved around a lot. It's about 5 miles south of Gloucester. Now, Elmore is mentioned in the Domesday Book, and I'm going to read this bit so I don't get it wrong, because I'm not a historian, so I need to be very careful. In the Domesday Book, it's listed as having 6 households, and a value to its lord of £1 and £1.50. Sometime later, the Elmore became part of the Guise baronetcy, and it's been in that position now for something in excess of 800 years. Now, Lionel first appears in the formal record in the registration of his birth, as one might expect. Now, the register entry lists his mother, Mary Prosser, and another woman who was present at the birth and who was the informant and registers the birth. Very little further research effort results in us finding Lionel mentioned in the 1901, 1911 censuses and in the 1939 civil register, which was taken at the outbreak of war for the purpose of issuing identity cards. And I'll mention a little bit more about that register a bit later on, I hope. Now, I can remember Lionel as a quiet, intelligent man in his 80s and 90s as I was growing up, and Lionel passed away aged 94 in 1986. Now, so far, so what, really, I suppose you might say. It's my family, I'm interested in it, why should you care? However, Lionel had a secret. Or rather, not so much a secret, but there were things about Lionel which were never discussed. The secret had 2 elements. So the first of these is that Lionel was illegitimate. And this can be deduced from his birth certificate, because it only mentions his mother. And the informant is another woman who was present at the birth. There is no mention of a father. And now, of course, I'd never seen his birth certificate, and this illegitimacy was only mentioned to me after he died. And it came up after he died, as you know, when a relative passes away, one has discussion. The family starts talking, and they don't always just talk about that relative. And we were looking through a family album of my parents' wedding from 1964. And my mother remarked, sort of as an aside, a slightly irritated aside, that Lionel had deliberately smudged the signature on the registration of her marriage in that church. And that she said this was because he didn't want her marriage to be connected with the registration of his baptism, which was in the same register. And that was because he did not want the stain of his illegitimacy to transfer to her through his signature. Now, that was how it was revealed to me. It was like, wow, okay, that's a bit weird, wacky, but cool, fair enough. Now, the next bit is even more weird, I think. So, some years later, after my mother passed away, a further conversation was taking place, and somehow it came to be spoken that actually people knew who my grandfather's father was. And I was blown away by this, because the people who knew were my mother's friends, contemporaries of my mother, born in the mid-1920s through to the early 1930s. So they were born 35 years after my grandfather, and they knew who his father was. How could that be? Because he never spoke of it. So this leads us to a set of questions, it seems to me, about what it means, what privacy is and what identity is, and what it was like then and what it's like now. So, clearly, Lionel's illegitimacy was not private. It is revealed in a public record. It's in the public domain. And yet, it was never discussed. His parentage is not private, because a village, it's common knowledge in a village 34 or 40 years after he's born. The person who was his father has probably died at this point, and yet it is still known who that person was in the village, such that children in the village at that time become aware of it and remember it 70 years later. So it wasn't private, but it was deeply sensitive. Now, let's have a little look at how privacy and identity work now. And I'll say this very clearly, this is largely in the European context. I'm conscious of the keynote we had yesterday, which observed the distinctions between human rights in the UK and the European context, and as I was unaware, the lack of that Bill of Rights in the Australian context. So in the European Convention on Human Rights, there's a qualified right to a private life. Now, it's a qualified right. And that means that a qualified rights in the European Convention means that actually, providing it's done in a lawful way and through appropriate legislation, the state can impinge upon those rights. So civil registration is a precise example of that. The state registers births and records facts about people, although they are nominally private facts. And that's accepted as perfectly acceptable and okay. Now, there's inside the European Convention on Human Rights, there's in fact a less qualified right, which is the right to identity. In other words, how one identifies oneself. Now, we hear a lot about, apocryphally and anecdotally, the right to be forgotten. Now, it turns out that the right to be forgotten is in fact mostly about identity and not about privacy. There's elements of privacy in it, but it is mostly about identity. And despite the concern, archives are really not heavily affected by the new GDPR and the right to be forgotten, because there are appropriate derogations in those regulations, and it means that archives can in fact keep but not reveal things about the living. And that's the distinction. And that distinction about revelation is something we'll come to a little bit later. And I'm going to have to move on because I'm waffling here, and we're already 12 minutes in, and I've only got 45 minutes and a lot more slides. So let's crack on a bit. So the key point here is Lionel's secret was not private, okay? But it was a matter of identity. And in smudging his signature on my mother's marriage certificate, he was implicitly asserting his right to be identified as legitimate. And that's the point that I want to go away with. Now, very quickly, the village. How big is a village? Well, today, Elmore has a population of about 220 persons. In 1894, just after Lionel's birth, it was about 430 persons. So, what's the size of the group that knew the secret of Lionel's father. It's about 430 people, we can assume, right? Because it would have been that matter would have been passed orally. It probably wouldn't have spread beyond because nobody would have known who they were talking about, right? How big is a Facebook friend book today? Anyone know? Here we go. Average size 340, median 200. So, in other words, your friend group on Facebook is about the same size, give or take, than a village in the end of the 19th century. And as we've already seen, there was no privacy in the village at the end of the 19th century. Okay? So, my point here is the village is online. Okay? Privacy and identity haven't really changed that much. And for us, living online is still new. In 1894, everybody in that village knew how to mitigate and manage their private lives. The social operation of the village enabled them to do that. The challenge we have is we don't yet know quite and precisely how to deal with that online. We seek new mechanisms, and Facebook provides better or worse mechanisms depending on which release of the system they have. But as a society, we haven't yet managed to work out how to mitigate that discoverability. Right, quickly then. Paradigm shift in archives. Apparently the world has changed. Apparently it has. The world has gone digital. Everything is different. Emails, Facebook, case management systems, tweets, government service portals. Wow. Of course, however, everything is still the same. Governments make and document policy, citizens interact with the state, and people are wronged and restitution is required. So, has it changed? We'll see. Accountability and transparency. What are archives for? Now, I'm very conscious that in having just heard the wonderful lecture just before and having listened yesterday, that I am treading on dangerous territory here. This is, as I said, a personal perspective, and it comes from a European context, so please forgive that. Is it about the writing of histories, genealogy, and remembering? It is. Now, here's an ideal I've dropped in from a guy called Luciano Floridi. This idea of semantic capital, and this is the idea that you use information to understand our world, and you can regard archives as banks of this material, that in a general sense. But public archives are tasked with something else. They are the evidence base for the rule of law. We heard that yesterday, loud and clear from our first keynote speaker. They are the mechanism to hold the executive and the state to account. And they permit the restitution of wrongs, one way or another. It may take a long time, okay? It may not be perfect, but it is the mechanism we currently have. So, what does the archive look like at the moment? They're mostly policy files. What did the minister want to do, in essence? Some case or particular instance files. For example, in National Records of Scotland, we take all of the court records of every court in Scotland, every single case in Scotland. The record of the case comes to us, include of all of the documentary evidence. It all comes to the National Records of Scotland. Now, it's currently weeded. We get rid of the, quote, less important stuff, whatever that means. And we're conscious of that, the potential biases that we are introducing by going through that process. We have to, we just haven't got enough shelf space for it. In the future, however, things may be different. There's a very interesting collection in the National Archives in Kew called MH12, which is the records of the poor law institutions from the 18th and 19th centuries. If you have time, I recommend you look that up. And of course, there are census records. But case files are frowned on as a rule. Now, when I joined the National Archives in Kew, I was introduced to a senior archivist who was in charge of bringing the material into the institution. And I had the temerity, as a non-archivist and IT-ish sort of person, to suggest that maybe in the digital world we might select slightly more material than was currently collected. And she spat back at me, "You're one of these people that wants us to keep your grandfather's bus tickets." And I mean, literally, she actually said that to my face in that sort of really in-your-face way. And it was, I didn't know quite what to do with that. And unfortunately, I didn't come up with the answer. No, I don't want his bus tickets, but I want 1 year's worth of data from the Oyster card system that controls the ticketing of London transport. Because do you know what? That would be a really, really, really good research resource. But I didn't think that up. But that's the answer to that. So what's it going to look like in the future? We're going to see much more policy records. We're going to get more fine-grained. We are going to end up with more stuff all over the place. We're going to get email, we're going to get web archives, we're going to get all this kind of stuff. But what we are going to get is much more case material. We're going to get the records of individual persons. And that's partly because of the experience we've had in Scotland. If you're interested, read the Shaw report and read stuff that we've done around Public Records Scotland Act 2011. The discovery of that records were not kept of persons in care changed our record-keeping practice in Scotland in 2011 with great power and great effect. Now, the other thing we're going to end up is we're going to have social media. We need the tweet exchanges because that's an interaction between the state and the citizen these days. We know that. Donald Trump tweets. Okay? That is an interaction between the state and the citizen, whether we like it or not, whether we like what he says or not, whether it is truth or false or whatever it is, he said it, and he said it in public to everybody. And so we have to remember that he said it. And we have to mark it accordingly. We have to say what it is and where it came from, as we do, but nevertheless, it's there. And all of this means we're going to have much more personal and sensitive data. Gallons of the stuff. We're going to drown in the stuff. But that's a good thing. Now, I want to talk to you about what sensitivity is. Unfortunately, it depends. That's always the answer in digital preservation and archiving, isn't it? It depends. And what does it depend upon? Well, I'm going to talk about, initially, the UK government context. This definition derives from the Freedom of Information Act, 20-something or other, I can't remember, 2000, that's it. And the various different sensitivities are defined by some 24 different exemptions that are defined in that act. And that gives us some idea of how one might begin to codify sensitivity. And I hasten to say begin. But let's think about things. Let's think about a text that describes the capability of a piece of military hardware. Now, if it was authored and published by a journalist in, say, Jane's Fighting Ships or something like that, then, and copied into a government system and used for reference, it wouldn't be sensitive because its source would be outside the civil service. However, if exactly the same text were written by a civil servant and not in Jane's Fighting Ships, that would give it authenticity, and it would suddenly be sensitive. So it turns out that who said it matters in defining whether something is sensitive or not. Now, consider now some financial information. Consider a commercial arrangement which has significant market consequences for the companies involved. So, prior to the formal announcement of this thing, it's incredibly sensitive. The instant it becomes public knowledge, it has no sensitivity whatsoever. All the commercial risk has immediately vanished. So it turns out that when things are said actually is a significant factor in determining their sensitivity. Now, consider now a text relating to an arms deal with another country. Now, if the country is a modern liberal democracy, where there are well-known and existing friendly relations between the two countries involved, then that's likely to have little sensitivity. It'll probably be announced in the press. However, if on the other hand the country is ruled by a dynastic and oppressive regime, when the relationship is more of convenience than natural alignment, shall we say, then the nature of the deal might be extremely sensitive. So it turns out that to whom or about whom it was said matters quite a lot as well. So, next, think about a text that was written in 17th century England that describes religious and ethnic minorities. Consider the language that that text might have used, the words that it might have used. Now, those words today would be, if authored today, would be considered hurtful and completely inappropriate, and therefore incredibly sensitive. Now, there is still some sensitivity for the fact those words are used in that 17th century text. But we must just, as I think we've heard already, and I've heard others say, we shouldn't hide the existence of those words. We shouldn't hide the fact that those bad things were said. So it turns out that when and the context in which the text was written, matters quite a lot. Now, there are some other factors that also play important parts in determining sensitivity. In England and Wales, we're governed by certain acts. Funnily enough, in Scotland, we're governed by different acts. This is wonderful stuff. Now, the Freedom of Information Act in England and Wales says you can withhold material from the public if it will cause damage to certain things. Now, in Scotland, when they passed a different parliament, the Scottish Parliament, passed the Freedom of Information Scotland Act, they deliberately and explicitly wished to demonstrate that they were more transparent than the Westminster government, and so they inserted the word substantial in front of that word. Okay? Now, that actually significantly changes. It raises the bar for material that is either released or not released. And that actually, it turns out, starts to change behaviours. We'll talk about that later, perhaps, because I'm already running massively behind. Let's think about jurisdictions and cultures. So in Europe, all of this is defined through the European Convention on Human Rights and GDPR, and this relates to natural persons. Okay? Now, they can live anywhere. It's not natural persons in the European Union, but they are natural persons. They have to be living people. Now, in the US, the locus is the US Constitution. Now, interestingly, there's a distinction that you should be aware of if you ever visit the US and you're not a US citizen, that there is a real difference between citizens' rights and human rights. Okay? As a foreign visitor to the US, you don't actually have many rights. Okay? You might think you have, but you don't. So be on your best behavior. Now, in other jurisdictions and in other cultures, there are very different perspectives in respect of person, privacy, identity, place, and time. And we've heard some of that today in your context, but I'm confident that your context in Australia is not unique in this, and that there are other cultures that have vastly different views of these matters. So, what is sensitivity? It's who, said what, to or about whom, when, in what context, in which jurisdiction, in or relating to which culture. Okay, that's hard to codify, right? Right? It's going to be hard to write rules about that. So that's why we need people. So, quickly, we have a dilemma. The archive has, we have a right to be forgotten, but we also have a duty to remember. So we're in a fundamental position of tension over this. There are some unexpected quantities, lovely word this, intertwingled. Oh, gorgeous word. It's the best, it's my favourite word of all words, okay? It beats them all, even beats serendipitous, okay? No, it didn't. It's a quote from Ted Nelson from 1974. He made it up, okay? And he defined it, okay? But it's brilliant. But what it means is there are unexpected links with unexpected consequences. We reveal something apparently trivial, it could be the key that unlocks a little pattern of knowledge somewhere else in the world that we know nothing about, and enables a secret to be revealed that we are not even aware is a secret, and we're not even aware of its existence. So there is something rather complex about this that we have to be careful. Now, let's just ask ourselves a question. Is the public archive now a threat? Is it a threat to individuals' privacy or assertion of identity? Because we've now gathered in all this detailed personal information, which we have to keep, right? We now have to keep it because we have to make sure that we can right the wrongs that have been done to people in care, in our custody. Okay? So we've got to keep all that stuff, but in doing so, we could be seen as a threat because we're now holding this vast amount of data, and we know that people get really twitchy about institutions that hold vast amounts of personal data these days, rightly so. So we need to make sure that this isn't the case. So, economics of public archives, long closure periods. We can close stuff in the UK for up to 120 years. I'm not going to go into the details of particularly when that occurs, because that will take too long, and I'm already running out of time. I asked the question, why would a state pay, why would the government pay to keep stuff we can't use? Right? Why are we going to keep all this stuff that nobody can see for 120 years? Because it costs a lot of money to keep this stuff. So we have to justify public funds. Now, what we need to do, of course, is find a balance of sensitivity and access. And that's what I'm going to, and a way of communicating that balance. And that's what I'm going to talk to now. So let's talk about sensitivity review. Now, sensitivity review, at the moment, and again, I'm going to use the UK context because that's what I understand. Let's look at the sensitivity review of paper materials right now. It's perceived as tractable, okay? It's perceived as a manageable problem because it's being managed. The volume is relatively low. The ergonomics of review on paper are extremely good. If you've ever watched sensitivity reviewers working as I have, it's amazing how quickly they can go through a file and establish page by page which page is or is not sensitive. Now, there's something very interesting. We implicitly trust humans who do this task with paper. There's an implicit trust in their judgment, which is, you'll see in a minute, perhaps not as well-founded as it should be. And there's little or no analysis of the effectiveness of the process at the moment. Now, the example of this is the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and they use retired ambassadors to do this work. They have huge domain knowledge. They review their legacy, essentially, and they want to see it used. So they actually act as a very powerful opening force, despite the fact that it appears that it's the establishment looking at the establishment. These guys have retired. They don't care anymore. They just want their legacy to make it into history. And so they tend to be pushing for openness, which is quite a surprise. Digital sensitivity review. Now, this is where it gets interesting. It isn't tractable right now. The volume is enormous, and it's a problem. The ergonomics are incredibly poor. If you've ever had to do page-by-page review or analysis of documents on a screen, you'll know how brain-bending that can be. It's really poor. Mistakes are more exposed, and this is actually one of the critical things because it goes to speak to risk. If we make a mistake with digital material, the search engine can reveal that mistake instantly. If we make a mistake in a paper file that's only described at folder level, then the chances of that individual mistake being actually visible to the outside world, it becomes serendipitous. Did somebody happen to look at that file for some other purpose? They probably won't find the mistake for decades to come. We need to think about uncertainty. These sensitivities are not single. One document isn't sensitive for one reason, it's sensitive for many, many reasons. And they have different timescales of decay. Sensitivities decay over time. I should have said that before. Perhaps you already knew that. And risk isn't binary. The context of access matters. As I've learned in listening to conversations in and around this event, this I know is something that Australian archivists have to deal with on a daily basis. Now, this is the interesting bit. Humans get it wrong. And they actually get it wrong all the time. We did some study of these FCO reviewers, and we tricked them. We did a sort of double-blind review thing with them. And it turns out that they don't agree nearly as much as they think they do about what is sensitive. Caused quite a little Scottish word, stooshy, when we discovered that. Anyway, so any approach we develop has to be able to deal with uncertainty. Now, let's talk about a little bit of light in the digital darkness. There's something called technically assisted review. Now, this comes from the e-discovery community. It's a technical approach that's used for establishing whether evidence in a case is pursuant to the matter or not when you have large volumes of digital material. And it's been used, actually, in a sensitivity review example, in the public release of the emails of Governor Tim Kaine in the Library of Virginia, and the work is reported extensively by Grossman and Cormack from the University of Waterloo. Google them, look at their papers. It's really good stuff. But it doesn't scale. National Archives in the UK has done some work on this. They produced a report in February 2016. I think Anthea Sellis was the author of that report. I'm not sure, because civil service reports aren't signed by the individual person, but I think she had a hand in it. Anthea is now the new Secretary General of ICA. And there's also a nice report written by a good friend of mine called How to Read 43,000 Cabinet Papers, which talks about these kind of tools and techniques. Now, there's also some really interesting work by a gentleman called Matthew Connolly from Columbia University, and he developed a thing called the declassification engine. Now, this is coming from a slightly different direction. This was a machine learning piece of machine learning technology that they used in an attempt to establish from the material that was released in the US context what hadn't been released. And they used machine learning to guesstimate what was in the unreleased material, and they did so with remarkable accuracy, much to the irritation of the State Department and the CIA and a number of other organisations. And Matthew continues to poke at the soft underbelly of this matter in the US context. Google him, because there's a recent paper that he's written that's very interesting. Now, there's a friend of mine, Graham MacDonald. As far as I'm aware, Graham is the only person in the world who is currently doing primary research into this problem. He's just coming to the end of his PhD at Glasgow University School of Computing Science. I managed to get him his funding. So that's why I'm particularly pleased about this, because that's the legacy of my short time in Glasgow is the impetus for Graham's work. It's really interesting stuff. It's very computing science, and it doesn't touch our world very obviously, but it's core research work. So let's talk about the other end of things. Supply and demand. We need to work both ends of the archival system. We need to work the end on the way in. We have to work the end on the way out. We need to empower machine assist reviewers on the supply side. We need to gather more nuanced risk information as that material comes in. We need to understand these sensitivities better and on a finer grain. We need to develop what I call gradated access models. So, positive feedback. What did I mean when I said that? I can't remember now. It doesn't matter. We'll move on quickly. Quickly, Gollins. Move past it. Yeah, it's a good question. What did you mean by positive feedback? Haven't got a clue. Never mind. Hey, such is life. So what I mean by gradated access is that at the moment, everything is binary, in the UK system at least. It's either closed or it's open. End of. Now, we're beginning to see scenarios where, and I don't know, where's going to get the right citation now? Just in the last week, there's been an announcement in the States of access to the Hathi Trust, has just given people enormous access to copyright material online that has previously only been available in their reading rooms. And they've done that by creating, I think, what they call pods or capsules, which you can work within in a virtualized environment on their systems, but you can work on remotely. And what they do is they prevent you exporting certain elements of the content inside that pod, but nevertheless allow you to read it and interact with it. Now, this is a technique that is used in the administrative data world for giving access to sensitive medical data to research people and various different contexts. And now we've seen that Hathi use it in that very public and open way. That gives you an idea of a kind of mechanism that we might be able to use in a digital world that replicates the physical constrained access that we might give in a invigilated reading room. And that, for me, is really interesting development. But that's what I'm talking about by gradated access. So limited controlled access. Certain persons can see certain elements, other persons may not see other elements, and that being fine-grained controlled within the system itself. So as I said, traditional approach is binary. Now, I mentioned the 1939 registers. If you look on the 1939 register, it doesn't just mention my grandfather, it mentions his wife and both his daughters. My mother, who's now passed away, and there's another line there that is actually redacted. Now, that's my aunt. I know it's my aunt, because that's the other sister. It can only be the only other person in the household. She's still alive, and she still lives in Gloucester. My point is, it's binary. She doesn't exist in the register as far as anybody else is concerned. It's only because I know who she is that I know what's underneath the black mark. So at the moment, things are open or closed. Now, digital techniques offer some other ways forward. This idea of what I'll call individual privacy with collective answers. Now, this derives from actually the work that one of the other teams of the National Records of Scotland do. Something that is unique about the National Records of Scotland is we're not only the archive for Scotland, but we are also the civil registration authority, births, marriages and deaths. And we also provide the demographic statistics for Scotland. We take the decennial census. Now, that means we've got statisticians who are dealing with detailed personal data day in and day out. Now, how can it be that we take a decennial census, which is definitionally private and is closed for 100 years by statute, and yet we release enormous amounts of information based on that census? Now, it turns out that there's something called a concept called statistical disclosure. Okay, and it starts to kick in when you have a sparsely populated area of somewhere like Scotland, where if you drill down into the statistics and get quite local with the statistics, it becomes possible to deduce, if you're not very careful, something about an individual or individual household from the general statistics of quite a big area, because there's only a few households, and there are only a few households with that might possibly have that statistical position. So you can work it out from the statistics. You can infer it. Now, it turns out that there's some fiendishly complicated mathematics, and it's so fiendishly complicated that there's only one group has ever actually codified it, and it's a bunch of Canadians, and every census authority in the world uses the software that these Canadians developed in order to do this. But I'll describe it as approximation, obfuscation, and pseudonymization. They do this process of sprinkling random bits into the data that doesn't mess with any of the statistics, but hides enough so that you can't conclude anything about these small populations. Now, it kind of does my head in, and I'm relatively mathematical, but it works, and it's a technique we should begin to think about from an archival context. And I'll call this the digital veil of ignorance. So we can imagine asking questions of a collection, okay, where we don't get a single individual answer about one person, but we get a statistical answer out of that collection. And suddenly that collection of private and personal information that can't be revealed and is therefore no value, potentially has value. And we can then justify and monetize in a policy sense, not in a cash sense perhaps, its preservation. And that's quite important when we start thinking about the volumes that we're going to need to deal with. So what do we need to do? How do we need to get to the end of all of this? Well, my contention is we need to understand sensitivity an awful lot better, okay? We need to find what I'll call for this purpose is a calculus or framework for describing sensitivity. Now, the intelligence community has one. It's called the label, and it goes at the top of your document. It says top secret banana pineapple, release to friendly eyes only. I've changed the words to protect the guilty there, but it does say something remarkably like that. And so they have a calculus, but that calculus is only for national security information. We need a calculus for all the other stuff that I was talking about earlier, all those what, where, hows, whos, and whens. And we're going to need to do some really deep thinking about that. We're going to need to draw on the philosophy of ethics. We're going to need to draw on ethnographic studies. We're going to need to understand human behaviors. And we're going to need to draw on political and social sciences. This is truly a multidisciplinary problem. This is not a problem, with greatest respect to colleagues in the room, that archivists can solve. I'm sorry, it just isn't. It's just too hairy and scary. We're going to need to partner up with some people to do this. And that turns out to be very challenging. We need to understand risk better. We need to be more quantitative about our risks and less qualitative. We need to give these risk numbers so we can actually say to politicians, to authorities, there's a 1 in 500 chance that if we release this collection of data, that somewhere in it there will be some personal data. But we think that that's an acceptable level of risk because actually the benefit of releasing that collection of material outweighs that risk and that damage. At the moment, we can't get anywhere close to having numbers like that would enable us to talk about the risk. And why do we need to do that? Well, because this is something to what I'll call the stopping problem. If you've got a pile of digital stuff that you know you haven't got enough people to look at, and you've got a computer that's helping you, when do you know that the computer has done a good enough job on the total collection? You have to be able to work out at what point the risk becomes, of the collection as a whole, becomes small enough to be worth taking. And to do that, you need to quantify the risk much more accurately than we currently do. And that's the only way that the problem will be tractable, by the way. And we need to understand what's coming in. We need to look upstream. Now, we need research in algorithms. We need to understand the features that drive sensitivity. I can talk about this later if people want. I get quite excited about that one, but I haven't the time. We need to understand ergonomics. Remember what I said, sensitivity review is a nightmare from the ergonomic perspective. You know that. You've all used screens to look at digitized documents. Your eyes glaze over after about after half a dozen. We did this with some FCO reviewers. They said if we have to work like this, we're going to leave. They went, no, we're not doing that. We can't cope with it. Give us our paper back. And that was only reviewing 50 documents, okay? 50 documents. And they will review 50 documents in 20 minutes on a paper file without even batting an eyelid. But giving them 50 documents online on a screen, they couldn't deal with it. Just the ergonomics just don't work. So we need to and really need to understand that. We need to understand models of assistance. So here's an interesting question. If I've got something that can predict, but only approximately, which documents are sensitive and not sensitive, and put them in order of sensitivity, the computer thinks sensitivity. But I want the human being to come in and check. Right, do I start with the most sensitive documents, the one the computer thinks is most sensitive? Well, chances are the computer's got it mostly right. Otherwise, it wouldn't be any use to us. So I'm giving my reviewer a task that's a complete waste of their time, right? Because they're going to look at that and go, yeah. So we've already wasted a huge amount of reviewer time. However, that order is something that a reviewer can understand. Okay? They can cognitively get their head around the fact they're looking at the most sensitive stuff first. Okay, flip it round. What if we show them the stuff that the computer thinks isn't sensitive? Well, exactly the same problem, right? You go, yeah. In fact, you go on yeah for a lot longer that way because there's more non-sensitive than there is sensitive. So that doesn't work either. All right, so the optimal, from a computing perspective, the optimal order to give that in is the most uncertain document first, because that's the one that gives most return for the computer to be able to make another estimate of what the correct place to draw the line, okay? Problem with that is that blows the mind of the reviewer because this thing is coming in some weird order and it bounces, subject matters go all over the place from one document to the next, and they can't keep their heads together. So there's a real problem here in terms of how we provide machine assistance. And that's got nothing to do with algorithms, but it's everything to do with humans. Yeah, I know, I got to crack on here. I'm nearly there. So, when to stop? There we go. Test collections. How do we know it works? Right? We've got to have some example collections that we can run this stuff over to prove that it's functional. We need to understand what the users might ask because we need to know what a good enough answer looks like. We need to understand how to do this statistical answer in a way that is going to be valuable to the researcher but not reveal the data. We need to understand this idea of disclosure in virtual reading rooms, brokered queries, when it's safe to reveal, what the impacts of approximation, obfuscation, and pseudonymization are on archival use. We know how it works for statisticals, but we don't know quite what that would do to archival context, how historians would react to that, indeed how anybody would react to it. And we need active risk management. So what could the future look like? A more comprehensive digital collection, lots more policy documents, huge amounts of more case information, what actually happened to people. Machine-assisted archival processing. We're going to have machines that can assist appraisal and selection, that won't get rid of our biases, but will help us understand our biases and will help, hopefully, not encode our biases in a fixed way. Hopefully, we'll have digital sensitivity review with rights clearly balanced and respected, and we'll have machine-assisted description and arrangement as well. And then we'll have this multifaceted non-disclosive access and brokered access to our collections. This mythical digital collection that now exists in our minds of all this wonderful, detailed case material that we've collected over decades of digital preservation. There we go. 5 minutes over.